What up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Let's Ask Paul, where I answer all of your pressing electrical questions, whether it's the National Electrical Code or just electrical in general. All you got to do to be a part of the podcast is go over to the website paulabernathy.com. That's PAULABERNATHY.com. And there you put your name in and post your question. You click that button, and guess what? It comes to me, and you get into the queue. And when you're in the queue, that means that you could be selected to be featured on an upcoming podcast. But one thing you can rest assured is that I will either do the podcast or give you a response via email in order to try to answer your question. So if you are selected, guess what? You'll be on an episode like today's episode of Let's Ask Paul. All right. Also, as always, Let's Ask Paul is sponsored by Electrical Code Academy Incorporated. Again, if you want to learn the NEC, I have put together what's called the Fast Tracks program. If you're studying for an electrical exam, or if you're wanting to learn a 30,000-foot view, maybe you're an electrical inspector, or you just want to enhance your knowledge of the code and your maneuverability and understand calculations and, whether it's single family, multifamily, non-commercial, or whatever you want, then you want the Fast Tracks Black program. Now, if you're already licensed and you want to dig down deep and start to learn all the nuances of residential, then you want our Fast Tracks Red program. If you want to learn commercial and all the nuances about commercial, not just the applications, but the codes that are associated with those applications, then you're going to want the green program. If you're going to be going into industrial wiring or you want to learn more about industrial wiring, then you're going to go with the blue program. Now, these are all Fast Tracks programs. They're all a trademarked program that are created under our Fast Tracks learning system. And they're all available from our website. Just go to electricalcodeacademy.net. Of course, you could go to .com or .org too. It doesn't really matter. But just remember, it's all one word, www.electricalcodeacademy.com, .net, or .org. Like I said, it doesn't really matter. When you get there, you'll see all of the courses there. You just click on it. Many of them have a demo. We also have demos at the top. You'll see online courses. Click on that. And in the red program, green program, and the black program have an interactive course that you can go through and kind of see what's in the program. Of course, we also have demo videos and all that type of stuff to kind of give you some immersion in what you're going to experience in the program. So give that a check out. Just go over to the website and check it out. Again, we're growing rapidly, and we have so many students in our Fast Tracks programs. I'm just blessed to be thankful that I was able to put that program together years ago, and it's flourishing today. Okay, we had a record year in 2021, and we're already off to an amazing start in 2022. So thanks, everybody, for the success of those programs. Okay, well, today's question was submitted as normal via the portal over at paulabernathy.com, which is, again, just an offshoot of Electrical Code Academy that allows you, and I don't know anybody else that does this, it actually gives you a way to ask questions to me directly through that interface. And look, I'm giving you answers that you need, and that's the important thing. And so I've made it a point in our company to make myself accessible to you. Not like these other people out there who talk the talk but don't walk the walk. I'm here to give you answers, and that's what people know me for. So again, you can jump on over to paulabernathy.com and submit your question, just like today's question. So I'm going to read this question, try to dissect it because it's rather long, and give you a bunch of thoughts on it. So hopefully, if you're listening out there, your question got selected for today. Here's what it says. Hi, just started listening to your podcast. Love the format. Love that you reiterate things so I can bounce back after I've lost focus for a moment. Okay, that's called repetitious or redundancy training, and I've been doing that for years. I do it on purpose. Some people say, Paul, why do you repeat things? Trust me, I do it for a reason. For those that don't like that, you have a choice. You can either listen or you don't have to listen. There are other educators out there. Go for it. But it's my style and it's how I do it, and I'm not changing for you, so no sense in leaving a comment because I really don't care your opinion of how I teach. Really don't. Okay, so it says, let's see here. Where do we go? I lost my track here. Okay. Anyways, I'll get to it. So trenchers busted underground conduit where a 3/0 ground was connecting main gear, and says in parentheses, eye-line panels together. Plant has several transformers and main panels. So I need to run a new conduit surface mounted on the outside of a building from a box to the other end where it came up from underground, also to a box about 300 feet away. Because the underground conduit couldn't be repaired, they want to run the ground in a metal raceway for extra durability and better looks. Okay. Both boxes I need to connect to are PVC. So 250.64E1 is telling me I can't connect to a PVC enclosure, ? It says metal raceways shall be electrically continuous from cabinet equipment to the grounding electrode, end of quote. It says, I know I need a bonding bushing at the end of each conduit. Will this satisfy that, or are they saying I need to go from equipment to equipment? Remember now, equipment has a definition. Equipment is a pretty generally used term. I would even go so far as to say junction boxes are equipment, things like that. Fittings can be listed as equipment. Luminaires can be loosely considered equipment. So again, very generic term, by the way, and how it's utilized. So don't get hung up on that. It says, I know I need a bonding bushing at the end of each conduit. Will this satisfy that? Or are they saying it needs to go from equipment to equipment? I plan to splice in each enclosure. Irreversible crimp would make it continuous, I believe. So I guess I'm just unsure if this would be a legal application or not. Thanks for your time. Okay. So I'm going to do my best to try to dissect this because there's a lot of stuff. Whether you believe it or not, there's a lot of stuff going on in this. So they gave a reference to 250.64E1. Now, 250.64E1 is raceways or enclosures for grounding electrode conductors. All right? So that's what it's talking about. And it's talking about where you would run a grounding electrode conductor within a raceway down to the electrode. And you might have enclosures like a junction box or something like that where the raceway might hit it and then continue through it because its primary function is to contain a grounding electrode conductor. So we're not talking about cabinets where you're going to terminate that grounding electrode conductor. Just talking about getting from the connections to the grounding electrodes. If that's what you're talking about in 250.64E1, okay? Now, the way you made it sound when you said ground and the raceways, underground, and the distances didn't sound to me like this was a grounding electrode conductor. I mean, this sounds like it is an equipment grounding conductor. But I'm not going to go there because you used a reference of 250.64E1. And again, as a code person, I can only answer something based on the amount of information that's provided, and I can kind of go about as far as I can go before I kind of go, I just can't go there because I don't have enough info. But since you used a reference for 250.64E1, then we're going to assume in your situation what you are dealing with is a grounding electrode conductor, okay? And they're obviously running it between equipment. Probably, I'm not so sure that's what you're really doing because this sounds more like this is a bonding jumper because you're not running it from electrodes to electrodes and you're not running it from the neutral bus on the service down to the grounding electrode. And that's really not how it's described in this email. But because you asked the email and you made reference to 250.64E1, I can't get in your head. So we're going to just say that you're talking about a grounding electrode conductor. And it seems like the main point of your email is that you're saying, hey, I'm installing a grounding electrode conductor in a metallic raceway, and I've got to make connections at each end of that raceway to a PVC box. That's what you're asking, okay? All right, so I'll address it that way, okay? So the first part of your question says, Is it telling me I cannot use PVC enclosures? It is absolutely not telling you that you can't use PVC enclosures. What it is telling you is that raceway that is protecting or containing the grounding electroconductor has to be electrically continuous. Now, what is electrically continuous? Now, I can have different sections of raceway and that are not continuous, but I make them electrically continuous by making sure that the raceway is bonded at each end to the grounding electrode conductor. Thus, it is considered electrically continuous. Okay? So let's look at it this way. So let's say I go from a cabinet and I'm taking the down to an electrode. I'm just going to use this example. So I'm going from a cabinet, maybe it's your main breaker, which where your main service disconnect is, okay, whatever. And I'm going through that down through a metal nipple, down into a metal wireway, right? And that just happens to be what I'm running my grounding electroconductor down through. Okay. So that metal wireway would be constituting something called the enclosure. And if it is a ferrous metal enclosure, and remembering that an aluminum enclosure is not a ferrous metal, typically ferrous metal is dealing with containing or made of iron. That's IRON, by the way, in case I come across in my Virginia accent. Would not be the case with aluminum. And obviously would not be the case with PVC. So the way this reads it says where you have ferrous metal raceways, enclosures, or cables from grounding electroconductors shall be made electrically continuous from the point of attachment to the cabinet or equipment. And again, equipment is defined and it's very broad. It's a very generally used term. I would say these boxes are equipment. Okay. It says from the equipment, from a connection, from attachment to the cabinets or equipment to the grounding electrode, and shall be securely fastened to the ground clamp or fitting. Okay. Now, one thing you have to understand is in that language, it also goes on to say ferrous metal raceways, enclosures, and cables shall be bonded to each end of the raceway or enclosure to the grounding electrode or grounding electroconductor to create electrically parallel paths. All right, so let me give you an example. So I come out of a cabinet and I come down through a metal nipple and I hit a metal. And again, we'll assume that the cabinet is ferrous. Okay, got iron in it. We'll assume the wireway's got iron in it. We'll assume the nipple is metal, rigid's got iron in it. Okay, and so my grounding electroconductor is passing through the nipple down into the metal wireway. Well, I have to connect at least one end of that, the end of the nipple that goes into the wireway. I need to put a bushing on it, and I need to make a jumper over to the grounding electroconductor as it moves through that enclosure. Right? Now, on the other end of it, it's connected by the lock nuts to the actual cabinet, which incidentally is connected to the grounding electroconductor because you should have a main bonding jumper in there. So that's already taken place. But now that grounding electroconductor is down into the metal wireway, you need to bond to what? You need to bond to the enclosure from that grounding electroconductor. Why? Because that is a ferrous metal enclosure. And so you already took care of the nipple part. That's a separate enclosure. Okay, that's a separate raceway. So now I've got to bond over to the metal wireway once that bond is done. So now let's say that the grounding electroconductor continues on, goes to the left through the metal wireway, and now it goes through another small raceway. And maybe it doesn't matter how small. Say it's a 5 foot, 6 foot, 7 foot, whatever, another rigid metal conduit. Okay, now one end of that conduit is connected to the enclosure, right? And that is why we actually made the jumper from the grounding electroconductor over to the actual metal wireway, right? Okay, because at that point, I really don't need to go to a bushing that connects the raceway when it connects to that wireway because it's already done because of that jumper from the grounding electroconductor over to the wireway, which is connected to the raceway on that end with the lock nut. So that part's done. So now the grounding electroconductor goes through the raceway, right? And then it comes out the other end, and let's say the raceway stops. Well, if that is a ferrous raceway, then I have to connect the other end of that raceway to the grounding electrode conductor. Now, there's many ways I can do it. I can do a clamp on the raceway and then have a jumper, a bonding jumper from there over to a split bolt, let's say, that's onto the grounding electrode conductor. Or I could take it and put a bonding bushing at the end and loop it through that if that's what I want to do. However, I'm bonding each end of that raceway. One end just happens to be bonded to the cabinet, which is connected to the grounding electrode conductor. The other end, you're physically going from the other end of that raceway, connecting to the grounding electrode conductor. And again, it is electrically continuous at that point. Now, let's say your grounding electrode conductor now keeps going, and now it hits what? It hits a non-ferrous or a PVC raceway, right? Okay, well, if it hits a non-ferrous raceway, then it is not required to bond that raceway, okay? No bonding on that is required at all. But you continue the grounding electrode conductor all the way through that raceway and ultimately connects to the clamp that connects to the electrode itself, okay? Now, it is electrically continuous from point A to point B, right? But it is also connected in a way that's not going to create something called a choke coil. Now, when you have parallel paths in a high current incident like lightning, and if you don't do it this way and make it electrically continuous, then what happens is the high amount of current travels on multiple paths and creates what's called a choke coil in this case. And it has been reported that right at the point where the grounding electrode conductor comes through the raceway, if you don't bond that raceway and make it kind of one, if you will, with the grounding electrode conductor, at each end, there's many ways to do it, then what happens is you create what's called a choke coil. And it could burn out that connection to that. It could burn out the grounding electrode conductor and make it pointless. Defeats the purpose, right? So there's many ways to do this. So I'm going to give you a bunch of different scenarios and we'll address your scenario. So the first scenario is if I were to run EMT as a protection and it's ferrous steel, then I would run it from the cabinet all the way down to the grounding electrode. And then at the end, I would put the kind of clamp on it that would allow it to actually clamp the one end of the EMT to make a connection to the grounding electrode conductor right before it terminates on the electrode. And then the other end would be connected to the cabinet. And as the grounding electrode conductor comes through that raceway or tubing, it's going to go straight to the grounding and bonding bus. Okay, where you in the service panel, that's your main, where you're gonna have the main bonding jumper and everything. Okay, so theoretically, they're all connected together, so I don't need a bonding bushing and loop it through at the cabinet because they're all intimate with each other. That side is already done. But the end where the electrode is, I have to make sure. Now, if you don't get one of those clamps that fit on the end, then you get one of the clamps that go on the actual tubing itself with a lug on it, and then you actually will put a split bolt onto the grounding electrode conductor, and you're going to put a jumper up to the actual clamp that's clamped on the actual tubing. That is one way to do it at that end where the electrode is. You with me? That's just one way to do it. The other thing about the bonding jumper, I want to make it really clear that bonding jumper that's used for the grounding electrode conductor, for the raceway or cable armor, if that's what you're doing, it has to be the same size as or larger than the required enclosed grounding electrode conductor. So if I'm doing ground rods, for example, the bonding jumper, if I was doing that, would not have to be larger than a 6. That's the same as it would be for the requirement for the grounding electrode conductor. So typically what you'd run into is the jumper, in order to be able to jump these pieces to make it electrically continuous, those bonding jumpers would have to be the same size as the grounding electrode conductor that's being protected by the raceway that it's running in. You with me? Obviously, if it's PVC, Schedule 80 offers the same amount of protection. You ain't got to do anything, right? So behooves you to run it. Now, in this case, let's address the question again, because that was a long way around me giving you just some theories here. And I get it's hard to get it in a podcast. But now let me answer your question, because really the only one that matters is answering your question. So one of the question is, can I install PVC enclosures at each end of this raceway that's containing a grounding electrode conductor? First and foremost, the answer is yes. However, you do have to bond each end of that raceway to, the grounding electrode conductor. because it has to be electrically continuous, as that grounding electroconductor will go through that non-metallic enclosure and keep on its journey. You have to make sure that each end of that raceway, if it is a ferrous raceway, and you didn't express that, but you said metal, so we'll assume it's ferrous, contains iron, okay, then you are. So the easiest way to do this is to make sure that when you cut those boxes into those plastic boxes, that it extends in enough that you can actually get a bonding bushing on there with a bonding lug, that you can make sure that you can make that connection with the grounding electroconductor through that lug, and that's going to be connecting the GEC to that raceway. And it has to be done at each end, because that's what it tells you in E1, okay? So that is what's going to maintain it, so that we have that you have the parallel paths, but they're at the same impedance. Okay, we don't have two separate paths with different impedances, and that can affect how much current travels at high current on any given path. And one of the paths might be inadequate, or it doesn't divide evenly. We need to make them act as one, right? So that's why we're doing it. So we're tying all this, and that's kind of the concept as well of making it electrically continuous, if you will. So basically, if you have a big surge of current from lightning, let's say, and it's going to the electrode, and it gets to that portion on the raceway where it's a ferrous metal raceway, okay, then what happens is it doesn't run on the grounding electroconductor and then also run on the actual raceway, creating a magnetic field that creates an actual choke effect, and it reduces the effectiveness of that grounding electroconductor. Now, if you tie them both together, the grounding electroconductor and the actual raceway together, if it is ferrous raceway, then what happens, they act as one and everything works fine and you don't have any issues. Okay. So in your case, can you do the PVC enclosures? Absolutely. You do have to make sure though, because the PVC can be pretty thick. You do need to make sure that your couplings and everything that goes through that PVC extends enough for you to be able to get the lock nut on for mechanical. And then you're able to actually get the bonding bushing on there in order to be able to make all this happen. If you can make all that happen, then you're perfectly fine. There's nothing in here that says that you can't use a PVC. So I wouldn't get lost in the minutia of it. That is a perfectly acceptable application, and you're taking care of that by making sure that each end of that metal raceway is actually bonded to the grounding electrode conductor. Okay? Hopefully that answers your question. Now, the second part of that question is talking about if it is a grounding electroconductor, because I'm going to remind you of something. If it's connecting other electrodes together and things like that, then that's a bonding jumper. That one's not required to be continuous. Okay? It's the grounding electroconductor that's required to be continuous. So not knowing what this conductor is, because you talked about it jumping from different cabinets and whatever you're doing with it, maybe it's going from electrode to electrode. I'm not sure exactly what you're doing with it, but just remember the continuous requirement is for the grounding electrode conductor. And so again, if we're going to assume that's what it is, and that's what you're talking about, then you're absolutely right. It would be considered continuous under that application. Of course, as you know, you do have allowances in 250.64C, which says except as provided in 250.30A5 and A6 and 250.30A1 and 250.68C, grounding electroconductors shall be installed in one continuous length without a splice or joint. If necessary, splices or connections shall be made as permitted in 1 through 4. And it gives you some ability in item 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay. So yes, you do have some options here. Just remember what we're talking about. We're talking about grounding electroconductors. Or what you may have, and I can't tell you because you didn't explain it to me in more detail, is you might just have a bonding jumper connecting electrodes together in that scenario like that. So again, we'll give you all the information so that if it happens to be a grounding electroconductor, then you're okay. Doesn't matter. Now, obviously, the boxes, obviously they're plastic, no bonding there, no brainer, right? But you do have that isolated metal raceway that you do not want to have parallel paths for lightning's large current that will be traveling on that in a lightning strike, for example. So just bond each end of that raceway to the grounding electroconductor, and you're good to go. That's not a problem at all. So you shouldn't have any problem with that. All right. Hopefully that answered that question today. And we're going to end on that question for this episode because, that's, 25 minutes is about what people can palate. Sometimes I do longer. But hopefully that gave you a really good view. If you want more information on grounding and bonding, and this example is covered in our grounding and bonding program. So if you didn't know it, we do have a grounding and bonding program. It's the Purple Fast Tracks. It's available on our website. It really has in-depth understanding of grounding and bonding, goes into stories. I worked on this book with Phil Simmons, who we both sit on Code Panel 5. And so we really start getting into the more in-depth aspects of the installation to kind of give you an understanding. And it just so happens that we have a great illustration of this exact example taking place and how you would do and how would you bond the different sections of the Raceways in this layout. And it shows you enclosures and Raceways in the overall scheme. And it is a really good read. I'm not saying it because I helped write it, but it is a really good read. So check it out if you're interested in getting more knowledge on the grounding and bonding program. It's available on our website. So check that out. All right. That's it for today's episode, folks. Hope you got something out of it. Until next time, if you got any questions, go to paulabernathy.com. Submit your questions to me, and I'm more than happy to try to answer them for you. Until next time, stay safe. God bless.